It is requesting. Okay, you start it, Ragini. So when I'm... go ahead. When I'm speaking... Okay, go ahead. You mute yourself there. Yes.
Namaste everyone present in this meeting. I am Ragini Rajbhar, a research scholar at Department of Law, Central University of Karnataka, India. We have gathered today here to learn about mixed methods research design. This lecture will be engaged by Professor Judith Schoonenboom, who has worked extensively in the area of mixed method research design. This lecture series has been organized by Shodh, Karnataka North. This is also a part of mixed method lecture series as organized by Shodh, that is Student for Holistic Development of Humanity. Shodh is a platform created with an intent to engage the research community in research dialogues, in be it multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary. It is solely a student-run organization. Shodh aims to build an indigenous research culture to create a platform for collaboration for the researchers. This also promotes innovation for the welfare of the humanity. With this, I would like to request Mr. K.M. of Karnataka to introduce our resource person.
Namaste everyone. Namaste ma'am. Namaste all the faculty members and participants. It is indeed my privilege to introduce our esteemed resource person of the day, Professor Dr. Judith Schoonenboom. Professor Judith holds the chair for Empirical Pedagogy at the University of Vienna, Austria. She has extensive experience in designing and evaluating innovations in education. Professor Judith specializes in mixed methods research in education, focusing on mixed methods design and the foundations of mixed methods research. Together with Professor Burke Johnson, she wrote the highly successful article How to Construct a Mixed Methods Research Design in the year 2017. It has more than 2,800 citations. She has held invited workshop on mixed methods research all over Europe. She has been an associate editor of the Journal of Mixed Methods Research since 2014. In 2018, she was co-organizer of the biannual global conference of the Mixed Methods International Research Association, which was held in Vienna. Professor Judith has served as Mixed Methods International Research Association President-elect, President and past President in the years 2019 to 2022. With this brief introduction, ma'am, I over to Ragini.
Thank you, Krishna sir. Now I would like to request Dr. S. Lingamurthy sir, Associate Professor at the Department of Economic Studies and Planning at the Central University of Karnataka, India, to formally welcome our resource person.
Thank you, Ragini. I take the privilege to invite today's resource person, Professor Judith Schoonenboom from the University of Vienna, who is authorized and expert in mixed methods research design. And I hope it will be very enriching experience after having detailed lecture delivered by Judith Schoonenboom. So formally, I would like to invite today's resource person as well as all the participants on behalf of Shodh, Karnataka North, and I welcome you all. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Ma'am, you may start the lecture.
Okay, thank you so much. Can you hear me well?
Yes, ma'am, you're audible.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, and it's an honor for me to be invited to this to help this presentation, and at the same time, it's also very interesting to me because any lecture that you give, at least to me, it's not simply a rehearsal of what you've already done, but you always also have to rethink what you're actually doing, and so what I will present now are, so to speak, my most current ideas on mixed methods research design, and you will recognize some things from our article in 2017, whereas at the same time, hopefully you can see some developments. And let me now see how I can go to the next slide. No, that's not what I wanted. Oh, sorry, I'll go back. Okay, so I start with two different definitions of mixed methods research, on which almost all mixed method researchers agree. And so there's one, so to speak, conceptual definition, which is to bring together multiple perspectives to obtain a deeper and more inclusive understanding of a phenomenon than would be possible using one method alone. Whereas on the other hand, there is a data-driven definition, which says mixed method research is a combination of quantitative and qualitative data collection and data analysis that are meaningfully connected. And you can perhaps already see that whether you use one definition or the other makes a difference. Because if you start from the data-driven definition, the idea is, okay, I have qualitative data, I have quantitative data, and how can I best combine them? How can I meaningfully connect them? Whereas if you look at the conceptual definition, you basically start with the idea of one method, and then ask yourself, given that I will be using this one method, how could I, using a second method, obtain a deeper and more inclusive understanding? Now, the point is that although all mixed method researchers agree upon this conceptual definition, mixed methods design is mostly described using the data-driven definition. And what I will do with you today is to see, okay, let's have a look at this conceptual definition and how would we construct a mixed method research design based on the conceptual definition. So let me see. I always like to work with examples, and so you will see quite some examples during my presentation. And there is one example which I call the procrastination example. So let's just take some first steps in designing this example. And remember, we will simply start with the idea of having a main method. So this is basically a study that has been conducted and in which I was involved, but I will take you through the steps and then later on show more of this study and its outcomes. But the research topic of this study was academic procrastination among first-year students. Actually, we were working with first-year students in teacher education in the Netherlands, but we'll keep it a bit simpler and say, okay, the research topic is academic procrastination among first-year students. Now, to me, it's always important not to say, well, we have a research purpose, one research purpose, but actually we have two research purposes. because I am in educational research, and we often have a both a research purpose of the study itself, what we want to attain with this study, but also some more distant research purpose to which we want to contribute. And this study was carried out with the distant research purpose in mind of contributing to developing an intervention to remediate a procrastination among first-year students. And related to the study, is also a population of interest, which is, and to the distant research purpose, which is first-year students suffering from procrastination. Then a study also has an immediate research purpose, which is we want to understand the experiences of first-year students with procrastination. An immediate research purpose of understanding the experiences of those students with procrastination makes sense. So let's find this combination of distant research purpose and immediate research purpose. Let's now go to the research question, which then is, how do first-year students view their experiences with procrastination? Okay, and as a second step, and we are still thinking about our main method, is how can we best answer the research question, how do first-year students experience procrastination? Now, let's first see that I would think that perhaps qualitative data here would be a good idea. And therefore, I listed the possibilities of qualitative data in research, what I at least think are their main possibilities, and see whether they apply in this case. So one thing is to discover unknown themes and relations, including reasons, motives, and causal relations. And I think, yeah, that fits well, because if I want to know how first-year students experience procrastination, then I want to discover such unknown themes, because I do not know them. And so I think, yeah, that's an interesting idea. And another one is to establish the influence of context on causal relations. And I think, yeah, that would also be interesting in this case, because you also perhaps have an idea of how does the context play a role in developing Prof data are not qualitative data. That means we always, with all designs, look at specific methods. So although we can have a first choice, yeah, I think qualitative data would be a good idea, we then next have to ask ourselves, and what kind of qualitative data? Now, let's have a look here. For its conclusion would be interviews would be an appropriate method, because we want to know about their experiences, and so having their opinions on procrastination would be a good idea. Because if we would observe, we could perhaps observe some procrastination, but we would not be able to find out how these students experience the procrastination, or at least our observation would be very limited. We could see students having a red face or whatever, but if we really want to know how they experience procrastination, we will interview them. So here we have our main method. We have the interviews. So that's how design starts, I think, and most design follows such in my opinion, also designing something which in the end is a mixed method study, but would start with a main method, having a research topic. We have a distant and immediate research purpose, a population of interest, a research question, a main type of data, and a main method of data collection and data analysis. And in this case, the data analysis would be a type of, say, thematic analysis. Okay, But then we say, okay, we now more or less have our main method. How can we obtain a deeper and more inclusive understanding of procrastination? And then one idea comes to mind, which came to our mind, which is, we had seen in previous qualitative studies that students had been interviewed who suffered, who self-identified as suffering from procrastination. But we thought, well, we can obtain a deeper and more inclusive understanding when we not only interview students suffering from procrastination, but also have comparison populations, or we would only interview students suffering from procrastination. So what we said is that means that for our study, the sample of our main qualitative methods, the interviews, would consist of 8 students who procrastinate severely and often, 8 students who procrastinate to an average extent, and 8 students who do not or hardly procrastinate. And that's where the idea comes in of auxiliary data. So the idea is always to have a main method and a main type of data, in this case interview data. And now our idea is, perhaps we can use auxiliary data to draw that sample for the main method. And auxiliary data means that are data that are used as an add-on to the main study. And there are many types of auxiliary data. We will see that and ways to use them. So in this case, we would need data that would allow us to pick these 24 students of the 3 different groups. So let's see. Yeah, how to obtain that deeper and more inclusive understanding. The idea was, okay, we will compare different populations, and we will have 8 students of each population. And when I then again look at the possibilities of qualitative data, I think I don't quite see it. But now I will also look at the possibilities of quantitative data. And there I think I see something interesting, because if we look at the first, describe statistics at the group level and provide an overview, I would say, I don't know if that's very, yeah, it's interesting. But for the main study, the idea of describing for these first year students what their procrastination levels are is not directly relevant to the main study, which is about their experiences. So that's nice to have, but not very relevant. Uncover patterns among known variables, I don't think does not apply. But then provide quick diagnostics of individuals. I think, aha, that's interesting, because if we would have quantitative data, we can use them to identify students with high, intermediate and low levels of procrastination. So I think that's an interesting one. Identifying deviating individuals is not that relevant here, I think. Overall effects, establish differences between groups, I don't know, influence of known context variables, narratives. No, but I think in this case, if we would have quantitative data that would allow us to provide a quick diagnostics of individual related to their degree of procrastination, that would be very interesting. So we go ahead and we design for a deeper and more inclusive understanding. So we now have the idea, we have this overall population, which includes the population of interest, students who procrastinate, and both comparison populations, students who do not procrastinate or just not that much. And from that so our overall population is all the first year students, and our auxiliary sample, I would say, well, we just try to obtain a full sample of all first year students, because if we in the end have to pick students from that quantitative sample, then there's no reason that we say to some first year student, please do not fill it out. So basically our auxiliary sample, quantitative sample, is the full sample of all first year students. Then we need an auxiliary method of data collection. In this case, there is a standardized test for procrastination called Academic Procrastination State Inventory, the EPSI. And the main outcome of this auxiliary method of data collection is a procrastination level for each student. And it is this main outcome of the auxiliary method that we then next can use to draw the main sample needed for the qualitative study, namely 8 students with a high level, 8 with an average and 8 with a low level of procrastination. So what you see here is also why in this case we call the quantitative data auxiliary, because an auxiliary data are used as an input for the main study. And so here we have an outcome of the auxiliary method, which is the procrastination level. And this procrastination level is then used to draw a sample for the qualitative study. And that's, in this case, all the auxiliary method does, which is an important thing still. So let's see. Now we go to the real study, to a description of the real study, which says a study conducted by Visser et al. Examined academic procrastination, which is delaying study tasks among first-year students in an elementary teacher education program in the Netherlands. A total of 186 students out of 215 completed the academic procrastination state inventory, which assessed procrastination levels. In the following interview process, 22 students were interviewed, 8 with low procrastination, 8 average, and 6 with high procrastination levels. And what we see that in both samples, there are some loss. So not all 215 students for the quantitative sample completed the EPSI, but only 186. And related to the qualitative sample, there were not 24 students who were interviewed, but the students with high procrastination level, there were only 6 instead of 8, which in itself is interesting that it was with this group who had the most problems. There were they were not able to find 8 students who wanted to participate. Now, if we now look at the outcomes of the procrastination study, we see that students with low and average procrastination level were highly motivated to become teacher. That's what the interviews showed. And it was this strong motivation that enabled students with an average procrastination level to continue studying, even when they disliked a task. Students with very low levels of procrastination did not have any problem. They basically had no task they disliked, but students with an average procrastination level, they did have a task they disliked, but then given their motivation, they still continued studying. Facing task aversion, students with high procrastination level discontinued studying because they lacked this strong motivation. So the idea is students with high and average procrastination level both faced task aversion. Students with average procrastination level were highly motivated to become a teacher and continued studying. Students with high procrastination level were not so motivated to become a teacher, and they discontinued studying when facing those tasks they didn't like. And interesting, this pattern was without exception. I had not expect that, but it was without exception. Point here is now that this outcome would not have been possible without first including the idea of comparison populations, and also without it would also not have been possible without being able to select students of each of the three populations. So all in all, we have obtained a more comprehensive understanding of procrastination than would have been possible when we would only have used the qualitative interviews and only have used one population. So here you see one application of this idea of obtaining a more comprehensive understanding than would have been possible using one method alone. And one thing that's also interesting, I think, is that often mixed method research, that was also in Bryman's data-driven definition, he spoke about quantitative and qualitative data collection and data analysis. But what we see here, that the auxiliary method, there the data is not always analyzed. So because it's not about an effect, a quantitative effect, but it's simply about using, in this case, using the quantitative data to diagnostically. So that means that we can use auxiliary data in many ways, and analyzing them is only one, but we can also just take the rough scores, so to speak, for each student in this case, and use this to create groupings for drawing the qualitative sample. Okay, so we can summarize this procedure in the case of the procrastination study, and then see, okay, the beginning is about the main method, and it stops more or less with the main method of data collection and data analysis. And then we have to determine the main function of for which we need auxiliary data. In this case, identifying students who belong to specific populations. Then we have to obtain the auxiliary data. Next, we have to obtain the main data, analyze the main data, and draw conclusions. And this already also makes clear that the conclusions are based on analyzing the main data and not on analyzing the auxiliary data in this case, because the auxiliary data were just used to identify students belonging to specific subpopulations. Okay, now we have talked about possible functions of quantitative and qualitative data, but we can also talk about possible auxiliary roles for quantitative data. And here I have identified 5 of them. And the first is what we've seen, identifying members of known subpopulations. We know in this group there will be high procrastinators, low and average, and we used quantitative data to identify members of those populations. But there are also other functions. So, for example, one of them is to highlight the relevance of the research topic. So sometimes, for example, we do an interview study related to some societal problem, and then we can also do a quantitative study to show how to what extent the problem exists in the larger population. And what you are doing then actually is highlighting the relevance of the research topic. Say, okay, it makes sense to have these interviews with people because we have seen that in general, the problem that we are investigated is large among the whole population. We can also use quantitative data to determine where the phenomenon occurs. So when you are investigating, I remember investigating riots, and then you have to determine, okay, but where are they so that I can investigate them. So this is a bit related also to identify possible sites of interest. We can use quantitative data for that and see, for example, when we have several variables that, hey, there's one that's deviating from the others. Okay, that would be interesting. So, for example, I remember the study on the blue zones, on the centenarians, and people using quantitative data to identify those places where many people reach the age of 100 or more. And another thing is, and we will come to an example later in this talk, is discovering different subpopulations. So what we did in this study, the procrastination study, was identifying members of known subpopulations. We knew there would be students with low, average, and high levels of procrastination, but we can also use quantitative data to discover different subpopulations, and we will come to that later. So, given that we have auxiliary roles for quantitative data, we also have some auxiliary roles for qualitative data. And I also will explain one example. So one, for example, is to obtain participant knowledge for an intervention. That's an example I will discuss with you. But you can also obtain participant knowledge for an overview study of a phenomenon. So again, but now it's the other way around. So you can have the idea, I assume that this is a problem generally, and I would like to have an overview of this problem in the population. But then still, it could make sense to obtain participant knowledge of people suffering from this problem, because then you get a better insight into the problem and are better able then in the next step to provide that overview of the phenomena in the population. And then there is one way of using qualitative data in an auxiliary role, which is to provide illustrative examples. And it's not very, in the mixed methods community, it's often said, yeah, then it's only to put meat on the quantitative bones. But I think that's not unimportant. So still, if you're doing basically a quantitative study, but you want kind of to illustrate your outcomes, you can do so using interviews, for example, and providing fragments, providing quotations by some participants, and I think that's not bad. So yeah, it's also one possible auxiliary role for qualitative data. Okay, so now I come to a second example, which is about using auxiliary qualitative data to design an intervention. It's the mammogram example. And although it's a completely different study from the procrastination study, I still think we design it in a very similar way. So we start with the research topic, in this case, mammogram screening, and a distant research purpose. In this case, the researchers had as a distant goal to lower the rate of women who develop breast cancer in Santiago in Chile. And so their population of interest was women in Santiago, and their immediate research purpose was to develop an intervention to increase response rates to invitations for a mammogram screening. And here, I think it's important to see that this study is not so much, I would say, a quantitative study, but this study basically is developing an intervention. So we needn't always think of it when thinking about mixed methods, about combining qualitative data collection, data analysis, and quantitative data and data analysis. We can also think of combinations in which we say the main part is developing an intervention. So there, the main part is, so to speak, not basic research, but is developing an intervention, and we will use auxiliary data to develop that intervention in the best possible way. And so the intervention design question, rather than research question, is how can we design an intervention that will increase response rates to invitation for mammogram screening in Santiago? So then the question of, with this first slide, we have, so to speak, our main study here, or main idea is develop an intervention. And now the question is how to obtain a deeper and more inclusive intervention to increase mammogram screening rates than would be possible using our current knowledge as researchers on barriers to and facilitators of mammography or mammogram screening. Now, looking at the possibilities of qualitative data, I think it's especially the first one here and also the last one that are important because we can already see our current knowledge as intervention developers. There will be some unknown themes that we do not know of, but that might be helpful in developing the intervention. So discovering unknown themes, I think, is a very important one, and in relation to that, also to look at the experiences with mammogram screening in detail. But I think most important is discover these unknown themes. So, and also motives, because we're talking here about motives of people who do not attend the mammogram screening, or who do attend. But we are mostly interested in people who do not attend mammogram screening. So here we then have the auxiliary qualitative data collection, and for these auxiliary qualitative data collection, we turn to our population of interest, which is women in Santiago. So our auxiliary research question then is, what barriers to and facilitators of mammogram screening do women in Santiago experience? We then have the auxiliary method of data collection, which is in-depth interviews, an auxiliary method of data analysis, which is thematic analysis. And the main outcome of auxiliary the auxiliary method of data collection. In this case, there were two barriers were identified to mammogram screening, which included secrecy and fatalism. It doesn't help, and so we have feelings of shame, etc. And facilitator included support from a trusted source. So then this outcome was used to include into the intervention a brochure addressing shame, secrecy, and fatalism, and a personalized letter on the intervention sent to each person of the target group by a women's own physician. And we also can see, using this example, the meaning of auxiliary. Auxiliary here, as it does in other example, means that we have a method, and that method leads to a specific outcome, and that outcome is used in the main study. In this case, the outcome is used in developing the intervention. Auxiliary does not mean that the auxiliary method is less important, and I want to emphasize that. So also in the first example, using the quantitative data to distinguish these three groups was extremely important, because without that comparison, the researchers would not have been able to discover these differences between the three groups. And here it is the same. Without the auxiliary method of qualitative interviews, the intervention would not have contained this brochure and this personalized letter. So auxiliary only refers to the idea whose outcome of which methods is included in which other method, and does not say anything about importance. Okay, questions? I can do that.
Ma'am, it's okay with us. You may take it at the end also, and now also if you can.
Okay. Well, yes, I can take it now, please. Dr. Prakash Naragund.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Very nice session.
Dr. Prakash, you wanted to ask any question, sir?
No question. Very nice lecturing. Thank you very much.
Sorry for the intervention, ma'am.
No problem. Thank you. Thank you so much. So now we can have a look at the description of the mammogram intervention. So this was an intervention by Puschel and Thompson in 2011 in Santiago. And the aim was to increase response rates to invitation for mammogram screening, which at the time were a mere 12%. The strategies used in the intervention were based on themes that emerged from interviews with women from the target groups about barriers to and facilitators of mammography screening. And based on the interviews, the researchers included a brochure addressing shame, secrecy, fatalism, and a personalized letter on the intervention by a women's own physician. And after that, Puschel and Thompson evaluated the intervention. So they evaluated their own intervention. And as a result of their intervention, the response rates from mammogram screening increased from 6% in the control group to 52% and 70% in the experimental groups. And again, we can say, okay, this outcome would not have been possible without including into the interventions the barriers and facilitator as experienced by the target group. So again, we have this obtaining a more inclusive, but in this case not so much understanding, but a more inclusive intervention. Now, there's one thing I also wanted to say, and that it's important, I think, not to describe Puschel and Thompson as a simple, so to speak, mixed method study of having qualitative data, which are these which lead to the themes experienced by the target group, and we have quantitative data that are the evaluation data of the intervention. Because if you present the study in that way, you are more or less doing as if they are connected directly, but they're not. The qualitative data are not auxiliary data for the quantitative study, but the qualitative data are auxiliary data for the intervention. And then the intervention is analyzed using quantitative data, but the intervention might have been analyzed using qualitative data. And that does not change the role of the qualitative auxiliary data, which are included into the intervention and not directly into the quantitative study. So now I come to what I think is my final example. And this example is interesting because what we have seen until now are two different patterns. We had the first pattern, we had qualitative data, qualitative interviews as the main method, and quantitative data were auxiliary, were not analyzed, but were used diagnostically. In the second example, we still see that the qualitative data were analyzed because the themes were derived, and there were also, in the end, analyzed quantitative data, but not at the same time. And what we see here is something that's called a mixed analysis, where we analyze qualitative and quantitative data at the same time. We analyze them together, but still we can identify, I think, a main method and auxiliary method or auxiliary data. So let's have a look. Here the research topic, and we can see it's the same pattern again. We start with a research topic, which in this case is language problems of first-year international students at one university in the US during their first semester. And the distant research purpose was to contribute to support measures for those international students. And the population of interest is basically the first-year international students having language problems, because the distant idea is, okay, how can we tackle these language problems? So basically, the students who are in whom we have an interest are the ones with language problems. And the immediate research purpose, I would say, is understanding the language problems of first-year international students and the relation to their academic achievement. That was the goal. So the idea was, if students have language problems, then perhaps their academic achievement is not the optimal academic achievement they would be able to reach when they did not have those language problems. So that is the idea, which is very understandable and logical. But the question still is there a relation, and what kind of relation is there? So the research question here is, what problems do international students experience in their first semester, and how do these problems relate to their academic achievement? And so we will first look at the main methods and say, okay, if our research question of interest is, what problems do international students experience in their first semester, and how do these relate to their academic achievement? then I again think of qualitative data, because we want to know about their experience. We want to know about what problems they have, and we do not know yet what problems these are. So discovering unknown themes, in this case, unknown problems, makes sense to use qualitative data. And it also makes sense because we can look at their narratives of their experiences and events in detail, and see, for example, what they tell us about their problems and how they perhaps overcame their problems, what strategies they used, whatever. So a first thing for me would be, yes, we'll be using qualitative data. And the second thing then is specific methods. And in this case, again, it's interviewing. I'm sorry, there's so much interviewing today. I wasn't aware of that before, but interviewing here would also be an appropriate method, because it can be used to find out about people's opinions, experiences, and reasons behind their actions. So main method will be interviews. Hello? Okay. And then, now that we have thought about the main methods would be qualitative data, then the next question is how to obtain a deeper and more inclusive understanding of the international students in their first semester and their language problems and academic achievement. Then would be possible using interview data alone. And now we are using then again at the possibilities of quantitative data. And I think quick diagnostic, I would be interested in differences between groups. Although I do not know yet what the relevant groups are, but I would think that these international students would not be all the same in this respect. Some having more problems, language problems than others, but also with some these problems would more strongly affect their academic achievement than for others. So I would be interested in differences between groups. And we now see that we have a difference here compared to the first example, because there we had a known subpopulations. We knew there would be students with high and low and intermediate levels of procrastination, and that would be relevant to the study. And here we can guess, perhaps we will see in the next slide, but we are not entirely sure what groups exactly will be relevant in this respect. So let's have a look. We will do some auxiliary quantitative data collection. So the overall population we are now looking at is larger than the population of interest, which is the student with language problems. But we now will look at all international students after their first semester. We will also try to have a full sample of all those students at their first semester at that one university. And basically, we have here two auxiliary methods of data collection that we can use in combination. Namely, the one is that we have a score for each student on the language entry test, which was called the SEEPT, which is a kind of a proxy for the amount of language problems a student has. And the second one is the grade point average for each student at the end of the first semester as a proxy for academic achievement. And these auxiliary quantitative data and main qualitative data were used in one mixed analysis, which I will show in the next slide. So what we see here is on the right, we have qualitative data, which are quotations from students. And actually, as we will also see, it was a kind of reanalysis of existing data or of published data that Burke Johnson and I did. And what we see is, so basically we took all quotations that we found in the article, and we took the information on the C, that is the language entry test, and on the GPA, the grade point average. And we put it in one table. Now, what I also have to say is that for the language entry test, the C, there were basically three possibilities. 4 was the highest, indicating a very good language level of English language, and 3 was intermediate, and 2 was okay, passed. And there are the basic, actually the lowest score for the SEEP test was 1, but students who scored 1 on the SEEP test were not admitted. So we only had students with 2, 3, and 4, but we can use it as a proxy for language problems. And for GPA, the highest score is also 4, and that's the maximum. Now, what we did is, and the idea was, we will use these auxiliary quantitative data to create groups and see if we can see something. And basically, what we can see here is for groups where we currently do not know whether they are really relevant, but here ID 607 is on his or her own one group, because this person does not have language problems and has the highest GPA possible. And actually this person does say, I do not have any language problems. Okay. Then we have a group of students who still have the highest possible GPA, but who do have language problems because they have a C score of 2 or 3. Then we have a very large group, which is almost all students except for the last one at the bottom. And these students do have language problems, and at the same time, they do not have the highest possible GPA. And at the bottom, there is one student who has, who does not have language problem, but still actually the lowest GPA of all students. Now, the interesting group is here. So the main analysis is a qualitative analysis, and this qualitative analysis could be, the question could be framed as follows: what, if anything, distinguishes students with language problems who still have the highest possible GPA? So that was was the question we were looking at, and reflecting on these results, and I must say, I sorted the table many times and created many other variables, and still sorting to see similar students next to each other. And then after doing that for a while, I discovered something, namely that if we look at 609, for example, is someone who indicates a language problem. Professor is old and his pronunciation is not clear. Then this person says he usually handed out important contents and I could understand it by reading the textbook. So what this a student does is saying, I have a problem, pronunciation is not clear, but I have a strategy of dealing with this problem, namely, I read the textbook. And so I can still obtain, is the idea, a high GPA, because I can kind of compensate for the bad pronunciation by this old professor by reading the textbook. And if we look at idea 1315, we see something similar. Because this person says, yes, I have a problem and it's related to speaking, but I have a compensation. I will get a good grade because my mathematical background is strong. And student 2020 says, I understand 80% of the lectures, which is not 100%, but careful reading complements 20% of lack of understanding. So again, we see here a kind of awareness of compensation. Here, less understanding in the lectures, during the lectures, and then careful reading as a kind of compensation. So basically 2020 and 609 had more or less the same compensation strategy. 620 says, I understand only 60 to 70% of lectures. It has my scores less than my expectations. That's not a compensation strategy. And still this person has the highest possible GPA. But still, I mean, 3 of the 4 students of that group speak about compensation strategies. And next question is, that sounds interesting. But what about the other students? If they all talk about compensation strategies, then that doesn't play a role in obtaining the highest possible GPA. Now, interestingly, what you see here for that very large group is that none of them talks about compensation strategies. Now, of course, we must be aware that this is not a solid outcome, so to speak, but because I only use those quotations which were in the article, in the published article, which is not much, as you can see all quotations here. And we do not know what else all these students said, but it's still it's interesting. So because it makes sense, the idea of using compensation strategies when you are having language problems makes sense, and it also makes sense that being aware of these compensation strategies is a good thing, and is also something which you perhaps could be used in some kind of intervention to support students who have language problems. So yeah, I still think it's interesting, because now we have a hypothesis that we could test either in a new study, or we could have a look at all data that had been collected. And again, no, it's not a solid outcome, but it's an interesting hypothesis that we can use for further testing. And that's basically what I say here. So Burke Johnson and I used the quantitative and qualitative data published in Lee and Green, study on the relationship between language problems of international students, their grade point average in their first semester at one university in the US. One specific group of 4 students emerged. Despite their language problems, members of this group still obtained the highest GPA. And the quotes show that 3 of the 4 students in this group refer to compensation strategies, while none of the students with language problems and less than the highest possible GPA did so. So in this way, we were able to formulate a hypothesis for further research. Language problems affect international students' GPA unless they deliberately use compensation strategy. Again, we can say that this identification of this one specific group would not have been possible without connecting the qualitative data of each student to their quantitative data. So we have obtained a more comprehensive understanding than would have been possible using one method alone, or for that matter, two methods separately, because Lee and Green had analyzed the data, but they had analyzed the quantitative and the qualitative data separately. My point is that also in this case, we can still identify the qualitative data as our main data, because it is from the qualitative data, from the quotations, that we can identify these compensation strategies, but the auxiliary quantitative data are very important, because they can be used to do the grouping. And also in this case, it's very interesting, because although what's happening here is much more sophisticated than in the first example, we still do not analyze the quantitative data. We just use the scores of each student, but we do not analyze. We did not calculate a quantitative effect, something which Lee and Green did, but we did not use that, because we really used the quantitative data as auxiliary data for our qualitative analysis. So still, I think the design procedure remains the same as it has been throughout this presentation. At the first, you design the core of your main study. You determine the research topic, your distant research purpose, immediate research purpose, your population of interest, and your research question, your main type of data, qualitative, quantitative, main method of data collection and data analysis. And then you design how you will acquire and how you will use your auxiliary data. And here is some literature, and I want to thank you for your attention. Okay, so shall I stop sharing my screen so that it's perhaps better for the discussion?
Sure, ma'am. Can we, with your permission, can we take some questions if the audience has?
Yes.
Dear participants, if you have any questions, please raise your hand or write it in the text box. If you have any question, please raise your hand. Sridhar sir, do you have any questions? Dear participants, if you have any question, please raise your hand. I think there are no questions as of now.
Hello.
Shiva sir, yes sir.
Good evening, ma'am, and thank you, ma'am. Little bit due to some network, I would not able to attain all the PPT. So my just a query. Could you please suggest me that what are the main readings on this to understand the mixed methods in a very systematic and simple way? For because we are also coming from the vernacular language, Kannada medium. So could you please text or something which can share to us, so that will be great for us. Once again, thank you for it's very cheer for us. It's very motivating. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for this question. Yes, it was also an idea that came to my mind. So basically, my idea would be that I afterwards, perhaps not today, but I think tomorrow, I can send you the slides, and then I will also update and see which literature I will include, and yeah. Okay. I here had a question whether it's needed to mention in the methodology section that the study uses mixed methods. That's an interesting question because it depends actually for what audience you are writing. So, for example, the very first study, the procrastination, we called it a qualitative study. And why? Because if we would have called it a mixed, although we used the auxiliary quantitative data, because if we would have called it a mixed method study, then people would perhaps have expected that we would have analyzed quantitative data, which we did not. So we used them in sampling. So I think there's two different things here. The one thing is that it's very important in the methodology section that you describe as accurately as possible what you did. So yes, we did describe in the methodology section how we drew the quantitative sample and the qualitative, and that we used then the outcome to draw the qualitative sample. So I think that's most important. And whether or not you call it a mixed method study depends a bit on who you're writing for and what the role of quantitative data in your study is. So actually, for example, the first study, we did call that a mixed method study because, yes, the quantitative data were auxiliary, but we analyzed them together. And that's the most integrated type of mixed method research. So that one we called a mixed method study. So unfortunately, my answer is not very, perhaps doesn't make it simpler, but yeah. Okay. Is it okay to apply mixed method in data collection? I'm not entirely sure about the background of your question. Perhaps if I think about especially here in the first and the third study, in both studies, qualitative and quantitative data had been collected. So basically, yes, I would say yes, that's okay. But perhaps that's not the answer you're really looking for. And I can add something to that, because often mixed methods and mixed method designs are classified, for example, according to what method comes first, or whether they're more or less applied at the same time. But I think the most relevant distinction is not so much the order, but is the question whether you have qualitative and quantitative data for the same people, for the same participants. So, and both are okay. I mean, you can have a study where you have quantitative data and qualitative for the same people, and you can do a study where you don't have, but the type of things you can do are completely different. So in both the first and the third study, we see that we have qualitative and quantitative data for the same participants. So in the first, in the procrastination study, all interviewed students, we had their level of procrastination as measured by this EPSI questionnaire. And in the third study, we had interviewees, and we had their quotations from the interviews. And for all the interviewees, we had also their their scores on the language test and their grade point average. And if you can understand that if you have both qualitative and quantitative data for your participants, you can do so much more than when you don't. But in the end, the important thing is I have my main method, and how can I obtain a deeper and more inclusive understanding? And if you can use auxiliary data for that, that's fine. And if not, it's also fine. Descriptive statistic is usually used in many qualitative studies. Can we call it mixed methods? Again, I think it depends, and it also depends on what exactly in this case you mean by descriptive statistics. I assume that most likely, for example, that you have, say you have 10 interviewees, and for all, and you have a table which list their age and gender and how many years they have been teaching or something like that. And in that case, again, I wouldn't call it a mixed method study, but in a very strict sense, you are right, because once you have a table which lists such characteristics, that is quantitative data. But for me, as I said, whether or not you call it a mixed method study is depends on what your public that will be reading your article expects. And if you did a qualitative study, for example, with interviews, and you have a table with the descriptives of the interviewees, then I think most people would call it and would also expect it to be called a qualitative study and not a mixed method study. So you also see how important it is to distinguish between what you call a study and an awareness of what you're actually doing. Because what you're actually doing, also with something so simple as a descriptive table of your interviewees, is still quantitative data. And yeah, okay.
Hello, ma'am.
Yep.
Hi, good evening, ma'am.
Hello.
I have a question. Ma'am.
Oh, I'm afraid I cannot hear you currently.
Neha ma'am, we cannot hear you. Ma'am, meanwhile, we can attend Vineet Singh's questions.
Okay, shall I perhaps first take the next question and then come back to Dr. Neha once the problems have been solved? Okay.
Am I audible?
Oh yeah, yes, now I
now?
can hear you. Yes.
Ma'am, I just want to know one thing, that what methodology is used in mixed method research? What methodology we can use?
Well, actually, it's a good question. In mixed method research, you call something mixed method research if it uses both qualitative and quantitative data. But given that there are many methodologies within mixed methods research, so there is not one methodology, but there are various methodologies that use both quantitative and qualitative data. So, for example, there are also methodologies that are themselves mixed methods methodology. So, for example, you have this idea of queue sorting, where people have to sort specific statement related to some criterion, and then explain the way in which they sorted these statements. That's clearly has a quantitative aspect, because that sorting means that they are sorting them on a dimension, which is a quantitative thing, whereas their explanation is qualitative. There is also, for example, something called QCA, qualitative comparative analysis, which is done on often on quantitative data and aims to describe specific patterns. So there are many mixed methodologies, but that's perhaps also something that I can add to my literature list, which I will send you, because recently there is also an interesting book which describes some of these mixed methodologies, and I will add that. Did this more or less answer your question?
Okay, thank you, ma'am. And
yeah. Then I have the question, can auxiliary data only be used for diagnosis, or can we analyze them if required? The answer is yes, you can analyze them if required. To me, auxiliary means that the result is put into the main method. So, for example, in the intervention example, the auxiliary qualitative data, they were analyzed. They were analyzed using a thematic analysis, and then these themes came out, and these themes were next used for the intervention. So there we have an example of auxiliary data that were analyzed and then used in the main method. And when I think, for example, of auxiliary quantitative data, I remember, for example, one qualitative study into, it was higher education in Georgia, where people from rural areas have a disadvantage compared to people from cities, and they were doing, again, interview studies to find out with people from rural areas to find out what their barriers were. But they also analyzed quantitative data to draw attention to the problem. So from the quantitative data, it became clear that there was a huge problem, because these researchers analyzed all entrance data in Georgian higher education from several years, and it showed that people from rural areas, really their chance of being admitted was much lower than those from people from urban areas. So in that case, both quantitative and qualitative data were analyzed, and the quantitative data, that was the auxiliary part, in my opinion, because it indicated, so to speak, the relevance of the problem that was analyzed in the qualitative part. Challenges in sample size in quantitative and qualitative methods. I agree. How can we solve this issue? Well, the short answer would be this cannot be solved, because we need for quantitative to analyze quantitative data. We most of the time need many participants, and most of the time we need more participants than we can, for example, interview using qualitative methods. So it's basically, it depends a bit upon the method, but most of the time we will have a small sample for the qualitative methods and a large sample for quantitative methods. What, in a sense, you would say is kind of our solution. I see two different solutions, but both are related to the fact that we have to define the function of our auxiliary data and the main data. So, for example, the sample size, the sample size in the third study on the language problems basically was 20 students. It was the table that I had, which is of course not enough for a quantitative analysis, but it is enough for using quantitative data to create different groups. So the sample size that we need also very much depends on what we are using the quantitative data for. If we are using them for and analyze them, yes, then we need a large sample. If we use them also in the first example to identify people for the qualitative study, then they do not need we do not need so many participants. So yeah, I think that would be my second answer. And my other answer would be also that if we think of the role of data, the study that I just talked about on the rural areas of Georgia, there it also depends on how you connect these data. So there were it were 150,000 students who were either admitted or not to Georgian higher education in a period of 5 years, and I thought 20 applicants who were interviewed, which was a huge difference. So then we cannot say that using the qualitative methods we can kind of explain the results of the 150,000 students, because that would be ridiculous. That's not possible. So we should put it another way. We should say, in this study, the quantitative part indicates the relevance of the problem, and the qualitative part just and for the relevance of the problem, it's okay. It's great that they analyzed the data of 150,000 students, and the quantitative method using the 20 participants. That sample was used to find out some of the barriers. So it also depends on how you see the relation between the outcomes of the quantitative and the qualitative methods.
Thank you so much, ma'am. You so clearly explained the question madam had asked, Bhagya madam. Thank you so much. You also answered all the questions so generously. Thank you so much, ma'am. First of all, I would like to thank you for generously accepting our request for this lecture for the benefit of the student community. Thank you so much, ma'am. You made this lecture so much understanding for all of us. Thank you so much. It was very, very significant lecture to us, especially at the end when you tried to analyze the data and the outcome, where you had mentioned that if we would have taken one aspect like qualitative data itself or only just quantitative data, then also we could not have arrived at the outcome that we have arrived by taking both the qualitative and quantitative mixed method of research. Thank you so much, ma'am. It was very, very insightful lecture to us.
Yeah, I also want to thank you. And I understood from your first words that you have a kind of mixed method series. And so I also wish you good luck with the series. And I think that is very, very important. And thank you so much for organizing this series and for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Ma'am, can you please share your PPTs?
Yes, I will. I will.
Okay, thank you.
I
Thank
will
you very much,
send them
ma'am.
to the organizers. Yes.
Ma'am, thank you very much, ma'am. In this regard, I would like to share with you that Professor Johnson sir has also consented his willingness to take a session. So he will be taking one session. It's indeed.
That's great.
We are so grateful to listen to you. You took out your time and explained us in detail. We are so much grateful, ma'am. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you.
Ma'am, am I audible? Am I audible, ma'am?
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much, ma'am. I will be in touch with you.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
And I will send you my slides.
Sure, ma'am. Sure, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, dear participants.
Yeah. It is the same. Yes. Okay.